Welcome back to Enjoying the Word. We're thinking about some Bible study mistakes. And number 5 that I want to mention is where we impose meaning on the text. So having looked at the passage, we're in this phase now of trying to learn what it means. And the goal here is what we call exegesis. We want to have an exegetical approach. I don't tend to use technical labels too much, but exegetical approach means that we're allowing what's in the text to come out of the text. The problem with imposing meaning is that instead of exegesis, we are doing eisegesis. This is where we see the text and we read into it an idea from elsewhere. Instead of allowing what's there to come out, we're reading into it or imposing meaning on the passage. Let me give you a couple of examples. This is one example that we can easily fall into, where we can be reading the Bible and imposing our own meaning on things instead of recognizing the historical setting, cultural setting in which it was written. In Luke 18, Jesus told the parable of the two men that went up to the temple to pray. One of them was a Pharisee and the other was a tax collector. And if we're not careful, we will automatically assign the wrong kind of value or the wrong connotation to each of those two characters. And the reason we may do that is actually because of Bible exposure and church attendance. Let me show you what I mean. A Pharisee. We see the word Pharisee and we think, well, those were the religious leaders that opposed Jesus, that ultimately forced Pilate's hand and got Jesus crucified. We can be very antagonistic to a Pharisee when we see the name on the page. And there's some justification to that. And then we see the word tax collector, and we might have, from our own culture, a very sort of benign view of tax collectors. It's just a sort of faceless machine these days, isn't it? You're just entering information into a website. There's not a man knocking on your door. But even when we're looking at the Bible, what do we think with a tax collector? Well, we might think of Matthew, who gave us one of the great Christmas passages that we read every year. And so we might kind of think positively of Matthew. Or Zacchaeus, little guy who climbed up into a tree and is in every single children's Bible storybook. We can have these warm, loving feelings toward friendly, smiley Zacchaeus. But you see, we're bringing a meaning that isn't what was there or what was intended originally. As Jesus told this story to his original listeners, when he mentioned a Pharisee, there would be a sense of respect, a sense of, wow, they're the elite, they're the best of the best. They're the ones that are keeping the law and helping us to keep the law so that we don't go into exile again. There would be a sort of favorable, if intimidated, view of the Pharisees. And then the tax collectors, they were absolute scum. They were the ones that had sold out to the Romans, that were working for the enemy and that were imposing the tax regime upon us. And so we would sort of come to this, if we're not careful, and think Pharisee, negative, but a tax collector, positive. The reality, of course, is the exact opposite of that. The Pharisee would be seen positively. In many ways, the tax collector as the very lowest of the low in his sort of own category of sinner. Tax collectors and sinners, right? Another example, Colossians 3:15. Here's where we may impose a meaning based on things we've heard, sermons we've heard, comments people have made. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. That idea right there of letting the peace of Christ rule in your hearts has been quoted so many times by Christians who are saying, I didn't know what to do, but I was praying for peace about my decision. I was thinking about which college to go to, who to marry, what job to take, whether to move, buy the house, rent the house, whatever. Big decisions, and I prayed for peace, and then I knew what I should do. This is often presented as a sort of guidance mechanism. Now, remember, we should always look at things in their context. The Luke example we just took was sort of historical and cultural context. Here, just look at the written context. Let me put it back in there in this paragraph. In this paragraph, Paul is writing to the Colossians, and he is writing consistently throughout the whole thing about a group kind of a concept. It's not individuals wrestling with God for guidance. anywhere in this paragraph, it's talking about putting on the characteristics of Christ, bearing with one another. If you've got a complaint against another, as you see there, forgiving each other, as the Lord has forgiven you, you should forgive. Put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. He's talking about the community of God's people. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts. He's talking to them plural. He's not simply saying, as individuals, let the peace of Christ rule. He's saying, let the peace of Christ rule amongst you, to which indeed you were called in one body. You see, the emphasis is all the way through this paragraph. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all psalms and hymns, spiritual songs, thankfulness in your hearts to God, whatever you do, etc. So there's an emphasis throughout this paragraph on the corporate nature of the body of Christ. And so this verse that we kind of plucked out and imposed a meaning into, that it was about guidance and I should pray for peace, I don't think so. I think in context this is talking about sort of the referee's whistle, right? That the referee's whistle wants to arbitrate amongst you as the community of God's people, the local church. And so when there's something said or something done and something doesn't feel quite right, where there's a breakdown, a disconnect between people, the whistle blows and we're letting the peace of Christ rule, arbitrate amongst us so that we can function as one body. That's much more in keeping with the flow of the context. So don't bring in and import a meaning. Look at it in its setting, look at what's going on there and understand it in context. It would be weird for Paul to suddenly give a single phrase mid-sentence about something that he's not talking about. The whole paragraph holds together. So don't import and impose meaning. Look at it in context and let the meaning come from that. If you want to support the idea of praying for peace as a kind of guidance mechanism, then I'm afraid you need to find another Bible passage for that, because this one isn't talking about personal, individual, private guidance at all. Okay, so there you have it. As we're reading the Bible, let's be careful to kind of keep our minds and our hearts open to let what's there come out, rather than bringing to the text our own ideas or things we've heard in other sermons, things we've heard from other Christians, things we assume from our culture. There's a whole host of ways that we could do this. But let's instead look to see what's there, allow the meaning to come out of the text as we study it, and in the process, hopefully, we'll be enjoying the Word.